Kia ora, good evening. Welcome back to the Cosmic Banter podcast. Here we are, episode 12, and this is part 2 of our story time with Brock. Brock was first introduced in episode 10, and if you haven't listened to that one yet, I'd highly recommend, strongly encourage that you go back and listen to that, because we leave off on quite the cliffhanger. And that's where we pick up from again tonight. Now, I want to quickly address what to some of you might be the elephant in the room, which is the length of the episode. This is a slightly longer one. Don't get me wrong. I do, in general, want to keep these pretty tight. Not going to be having Lex Friedman style episodes anytime soon. But for those of you that aren't perhaps regular podcast listeners, or perhaps at least long form podcast listeners, there's a couple of tricks I just want to remind you of if the length is a little daunting. So both YouTube and Spotify allow you to set the playback speed. You can increase that. Secondly, I've gone to the effort to outline some timestamps. So they appear as chapters on Spotify, where you can click on a certain chapter and it'll jump you straight to that part of the episode, or you can go back and revisit other parts. And those timestamps are also available on YouTube. And lastly, don't feel obliged to knock it all out at once. I mean, you can chip away at it. So you might be inclined to start this as you're drifting off to sleep or on a walk, and then pick it up again tomorrow night. Okay? Because I wouldn't want you to miss all of the stories that we have here in episode 12. They all link up, and it's pretty mind-blowing, actually. So really excited for you guys to hear that. Just lastly, as ever, there are a couple of donation options if you're so inclined to support your boy. I don't know why you wouldn't. The first is a cryptocurrency donations link, and I won't even see your crypto wallet address. So that's a great anonymous and cheap means of donating if you're so inclined. And the second is your standard conventional credit card and debit card donation option, which can be found in the second donations link, both of which are in the description. So let's crack into it. That was good, that was short. Tonight, episode 12, we're up to episode 12. This is the Cosmic Banter podcast. I am your host, Steve, and tonight's episode is called Coalescence of Chance. As ever, remain curious, and when the phenomenon decides to reach you, I hope that you decide to reach out to Cosmic Banter. Enjoy. Peace. How are you?
I'm great, Steve. It's great to be here.
Welcome back. I suppose this is a part 2, really, isn't it?
It is, yes.
On the Cosmic Banter podcast. But you left us with a bit of a cliffhanger. You gave us an incredible story last week, and I just want to start by reaffirming my appreciation for your vulnerability there. I wanted you to go deep into a specific story, but I wasn't expecting it to unravel so deeply as it did. And I think we left off at a pretty clean place for a part 2, which this interview will be. How do you feel about how last week went?
Honestly, Steve, it is difficult talking about this publicly at first, but as I went through it, I did really start to feel better at getting this off my chest. And something I did want to pass on to you was, since we've last spoken, I really feel I've been able to find a new level of, like, a place to put it in my mind, so to speak. I'm feeling so much better about having spoken about it, and it's really helped me process a lot of what has happened. So I'm just really grateful to you, Steve, for giving me this opportunity to talk.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. I mean, that's my goal is simply to talk to people who've had interesting stories, but if it has that impact as well, then that's fantastic. So let's pick up where we left off. Now, you're telling us about this experience of missing time, and that in and of itself was going to be a story. And then I caught you out. You said, oh, but I've since had some hypnosis sessions and sort of recalled what happened. I would encourage anyone listening, if you haven't, go back to the first episode with Brock, because we're going to do this sequentially, I think. You've got a number of stories, and we sort of dug a bit deeper, didn't we? And you, I guess for the first time, really shared what happened that night as experienced through this, what would you call it in hypnosis, for it's like a repressed memory?
Yeah, it was described to me as regressive hypnosis, and the techniques, the relaxation techniques, were to help me. It's like I always remembered it, but I just didn't know where to find it in my mind. And after doing the regressive hypnosis, it actually shocked me how easy it was to recall. And it seems now, in hindsight, it's like, how could I have not remembered that? But I guess that's just the mystery of however it works. It took me by surprise, I'll say that.
Yeah, I was thinking to myself, well, what if people think hypnosis, okay, then you're in this state where you're making it up. But that hypnosis is clearly accepted part of science. It's very real. And you yourself were there for what, just hour and a half, 2 hours, was it? It felt,
Yeah,
and you said it felt like you were experiencing it all again.
yes, it really did feel like I was reliving it again. I guess with the techniques they were using, I was able to choose how to recall it. Techniques like pretending I was in a movie theater and I could shut the curtains if it got too much. Techniques like viewing myself in the third person. But for most of it, I really felt like I could do it through my own eyes. Before your podcast, every single day after that, I was caught going, whoa, oh my God, that happened. And, you get this jarring feeling as you remember what happened. But actually, since the podcast, that feeling has left me. And that's something I wanted to mention to you. Talking about it has really, the feeling of shock in recalling it has really left me since discussing it. I would put it to anybody listening to this podcast, go on a podcast yourself. I guess Cosmic Banter would be a good choice, and talk about it. It's made a big difference for me. I recommend it.
Well, I'm happy to have been able to hold that space for you, I guess. Like I said last time, can't imagine too many traditional, conventional sort of therapists and whatnot that you can go to with these types of stories. Yeah, so where you left off, I asked you what I thought to be a difficult and quite personal question. And this is a spoiler for anyone who hasn't at this stage. If you haven't listened to the first one, go back now and listen. But where we left off, I asked you, for what purpose do you think they had you on board the spaceship? They were probing, and I knew that was a personal, perhaps uncomfortable question, but I couldn't let it go. And I'm so glad you did kind of open up a wee bit there. You believe you have an idea of why, and that's what this episode is going to be about. So do you want to just maybe take us through from where we left off last week?
Sure. Okay. I'll do my best. Your question was, what do you think the purpose of that was? And I feel, part of what happened to me was they took samples from me, and I said to you, I'm not sure if it was after the last episode, but I really felt like now I think I know what the result of those samples were. I think I actually have met the result of that. So I'm going to set the scene here. I had at the time 4 really young kids, and with my wife at the time and myself, and it was a really hectic, busy time. Anybody that's got little kids knows that. I was working and doing my best to support my wife and my kids. And old friend of mine out of the blue who does a lot of hiking called me up and said, "Hey, I'm going down to this place. You should come with me." And mind you, I want to make it clear that I hadn't been hiking or camping anywhere in 10 years. I'd just been too busy. And this was definitely out of the blue. And I said, "Look, that's awesome. I'd love to go, but I just don't see how I'm going to be able to get away from my life at the moment to do that." He was talking about at least 3 days out in the wilderness. And I just said, "I just don't think I'll be able to do it. I'm too busy." And he said, No. Look, go and ask my wife and see what she says." And so I did. I said, my friend has asked me to go on this hike with him, but, I understand it's not really possible, but he asked me to ask you. And to my surprise, she just said, "Yeah, that'll be fine. You go. I'll take care of everything here." And that was really unusual for her to say anything like that at all. I was shocked. So I got back on the phone and said, "Okay, it's on. Let's do it." So really quickly, this was organized and I was on the road down there. My gear somehow came from nowhere. People just, I don't know, like a guy I know just happened to call me and said, "I've got this camping gear." And it was exactly what I needed. A few other things just fell into place to make it really, really easy for me to get down there. And at the time, I just sort of thought, "Oh, well, that's a stroke of good luck." But now I look back on it and realize that perhaps it was a series of synchronicities. I didn't really know what a synchronicity was back then, or even knew to pay attention to that, but it really does seem like that now. So I drive down there, we hike out, and mind you, this place is remote. There's no roads. They actually limit the number of people there, so it's very, very isolated. Even getting the permission to get down there was just, in hindsight, very strange. But we're down there, we hike in. It takes us all day to get in there, and it's dark, and we set up our camp, and I've had something to eat. And my friend, he wants to go off fishing, and I didn't really feel like fishing. I just thought I was going to just sit on a rock on the beach here and have a look at the beautiful view. To paint the picture of the location, it's what I would call a wine glass bay. So it's a very small bay. If you look down on it, would be the shape of a wine glass. Sandy beach, rocky heads on either side, and forest all the way down to the beach. Stunning, absolutely beautiful. And not a soul around except my friend off fishing somewhere. And this is at night. The moon just seemed extra ultra bright, and the tide had gone out, and the ripples in the sand from the exposed sand looked silvery and incredible, and the light was amazing, and I could see the silhouette of the rocks and the mountains behind me. It was just stunning. And I was just looking at this place going, "Wow, I cannot believe I'm here. I cannot believe how beautiful this is." On the beach was this huge rock, and I guess it was probably about the size of a bus. So quite a big rock on the beach, and I clambered up on top of it, and I was sitting up there cross-legged at the front of this rock looking out over this view going, "Wow." I had a sense or a knowing, or I just knew that there was somebody behind me, and I was not scared per se. I felt anxious, maybe a tiny little bit scared, because I knew it wasn't my friend. And I slowly turned around, and sitting behind me were two people. And I didn't hear them get onto the rock, and they were sitting cross-legged like I was. And the one closest to me had a somewhat solemn look on her face, and the one behind her had more of a smile. And the reason, apart from two people suddenly appearing behind me, was if I sort of squinted, what really shocked me, and I kind of knew it as soon as I saw them, this is why I'm here, that I could sort of see that there was slight opacity to them, and I could see an alien grey in there, superimposed just lightly over their image. And my mind, there's no reference. You don't know how to deal with this. Ultimately, I think I was almost childlike in how I responded. And I felt tearful, as in vulnerable, but not threatened. And I looked to the first one and somehow knew that there was no need to speak. I could speak in my mind. I don't know how you know that. I just knew. And I said, "What's your name?" And without speaking, I heard the words in my mind, "A dune," as in a sand dune. A space DUNE, a dune. And as those words came into my mind, this incredible overlay over her face of these rusty red snow-capped sand dunes, just stunning. And it was an aerial view, something you'd see from Google Earth, but the way it was lit, it was quite dark. And I got the distinct impression that it was nowhere on Earth. And it was just a mesmerizing image that was superimposed over her face. And along with a dune was superimposed the words coalescence of chance. And that was just so much to take in for me. And, freaked out, I guess would be the word to describe that. And I looked over her right shoulder, and sitting cross-legged a few meters back was another girl. And first of all, actually, I want to just describe what this being that referred to itself as a dune looked like.
Yes, please. I was going to ask, but you're doing well. Yeah, please.
A dune would be about, I would think, mid-teens girl. And she had rusty red hair that was straight and with a fringe, and rusty red freckles all over her face, and these incredible golden rusty eyes that just, I've never seen that color. And just the most unique looking person you've ever seen. And it just all seemed to complement these rusty red sand dunes that were snow-capped over her face. Just mind-blowingly incredible.
And so, not to interrupt your flow too much, Brock, I don't want to ruin the story or anything, but to clarify, at this stage, you're looking at a human.
Yes.
Can you just quickly go back to, you said something about a grey alien being superimposed?
When I first looked at them, I could see like a very faint superimposition of an alien grey sitting cross-legged where they were, as if I get the feeling in thinking about it, and I've thought about it so much over the years, I get the feeling that they were just showing me
right
on. And
because you'd already had this experience and you were familiar with them. So do you think it would, without their presence or that image sort of somewhat superimposed, that you might have thought it was just normal humans?
I had the very strong impression that it was both a dune and this other girl were both a person like me, but also an alien grey as well. That was the impression. They were one and the same, and they were showing me that part of themselves, so there was no confusion as to what I was experiencing. That's how I perceive the experience.
Okay, well, you answered my next question, but please continue. I mean, so what did this other girl look like, and then what happened next?
I looked across the first girl, I'm calling her Dune. I looked across her shoulder at this other girl, and I didn't even really need to say, "What is your name?" I was actually I really feel like I was in a childlike state or a primal state, perhaps. And as I looked at her, she was already smiling. She smiled a little bit more, closed lip smile. And how she looked was her face was rounder. She didn't have any freckles, but she had these wonderful blue eyes and this streaming, curly, blonde hair that was sort of unkept and going everywhere. And as she smiled at me, what became overlaid over her face was a star and the words "as star." And under that was overlaid the words "light across time." And I have no idea what any of that means, but they were the words. And I looked at that, and her face was this incredible golden star with light streaming off it. It was just mesmerizingly amazing, these tendrils of plasma peeling off. It was really unbelievable. And I was just gawking like a moron, I guess, with my mouth hanging open. And I looked back to a Dune who was not looking at me. She was looking more across the top of my shoulder. And then I woke up and it was morning. I was in my tent, my one-man tent, in my sleeping bag. And I thrashed about and sat up and the best I could in the one-man tent and went, what? Oh my God. And I knew it was not a dream. I knew if you're going to have a dream, getting into a one-man tent's a pain in the butt. And you remember going to bed. And I know it wasn't a dream.
Dig a bit deeper into that. I know that you know that it wasn't a dream. What are the features or factors of that experience made you feel like it wasn't a dream? That it happened and then you woke up, almost like another missing time experience, right?
Yes. At the time, I didn't get it. Because I hadn't pieced together enough of my experiences to understand, but I would describe that as a missing time experience, definitely. At the time, I was just trying to make sense of it, and the thought in my head was, that's just so weird. That is just so weird. So to address your question, why it wasn't a dream, I've got a consistent timeline in my memory of the events, getting there, getting set up, cooking a simple meal, looking around, hopping up onto the rock, thinking, wow, this is beautiful, seeing these beings, and then waking up in the morning. I don't have any recollection of any of the things you do to get into bed. And especially when you're camping, there's more steps involved. And so that's why I don't think it was a dream. I had no recall of any of the events leading up to me getting into my tent. I just woke up in the morning.
I have to ask, don't be offended, but you weren't drunk or high?
No, there's no drugs or alcohol. I'm just not that kind of person. And especially not out there. I mean, it's hard physical work, and drugs and alcohol are definitely not going to help with that.
Oh, look, and I think even if you had, it still wouldn't invalidate the experience, but these are questions that I imagine people would have. So I just thought I'd ask. Please continue. So what did you feel? So you woke up the next morning. What was it like that day? What happened?
It was a normal day. I mean, we fished. We had a fantastic time. We cooked fish. We just enjoyed the beautiful surroundings, had a swim, and it was just a peaceful, relaxing experience. It was a perfectly normal day, except for I didn't ask my friend about, I don't know why. It just, for some reason, I didn't ask him about, do you remember, was I in my tent when you got back? Did you notice, or was I there? I didn't ask anything about the night before. I didn't ask him about it at all, ever. In fact, to I've never to this day even discussed what happened on that rock with him at all.
Conscious,
Best friends.
really.
Yeah. And mind you, him and I have had experiences of our own. It's not like we don't discuss that with each other.
Mm.
It's an uncannily weird aspect of this whole thing as to why I never thought to even bring it up.
So you say you talk about it as if, oh, that's strange. Why didn't I bring it up with him? It wasn't a conscious, oh, that was deeply personal and I don't feel like talking about it.
No.
It just didn't. So were you thinking about seeing Adrian and as Star?
Yes.
Were you thinking about it all day?
I remembered it. I couldn't process it at that time. It was such a weirdly incredible thing. It's very difficult when you're experiencing these things to figure out how to file it away. And of course, I thought about it, and I just want to make really, really clear. This guy, I've known him for a really long time. We've shared some deep moments together. We've been through tragedies together. You know, there's nothing off the table as far as what we discuss together. You know, we're the best of friends, and we've supported each other through thick and thin. This is not me thinking, oh, I'm not going to discuss this with him because he'll think I'm crazy. No, it's not that. I just, for whatever reason, I can't understand why, I've never discussed it with him. I could probably ring him up and say, hey, remember that time? Guess what happened when you were out fishing? And he would be, all for talking about it. And he's certainly not going to criticize me for it. I just didn't tell him. And I just think it's a weird aspect of this whole situation. But we went about the rest of the trip, and by the time I got all the way back to where the car was parked, I was pretty exhausted, and drove home and unpacked and went about as if nothing had happened in my life, except for this experience that I never told my wife. I have talked about it to people now, but I don't know why I didn't bring it up at the time. Another missing time experience where I saw a Dune again, but I didn't remember it until many years later. So
before you start that story, and this may be clarified in this part of the story that you're about to tell, but can I ask, on this camping trip, after you've had this experience, what was your impression at that time of who she was and who her friend, supposedly friend as Star, was? What was their relation, and what did they have to do with you? I just want you to really be clear on what this is.
That's an excellent question, Steve, and you're really helping me round out what happened. Okay, so the timeline from when I had a missing time experience where samples were taken would fit with the age of this girl. And I would guess that she might be 15, 16, 17. It's hard to know. But around that age. And although nothing was exchanged, nothing was said, but I can't say I know for sure, but it really felt like my daughter. And the interesting part of that is her friend as Star, and I'm calling that her friend because I didn't feel that connection with her. And I really did feel a connection that was my daughter. And I have daughters of my own. I know what that connection feels like, and that's what it felt like. I feel like that June was my daughter, and I feel like as Star was her friend, or at least not my daughter, somebody else's. And so the timeline fits that it would make sense that she was my daughter. So I'm going to move on now to another missing time experience. And this is about 5 years later from.
And I understand this is very it must be very emotional to discuss. So take your time, and appreciate you sharing this. But yeah, continue.
Thank you. Thank you. I do appreciate that. Okay, so I'll reset the scene now. I am working and I'm an engineering role. The task was to go out on to a site that was out in the country and perform some specialist work and then return back to the workshop and then repeat the next day and complete the work. And to get the work done, I had a colleague with me and we were driving a truck. The reason we were driving a truck was that the equipment that we needed, the specialist equipment, was so large it wouldn't fit in a conventional vehicle. So I don't mean a pickup truck, I mean a natural big rig, a truck, or whatever you want to call it for wherever you're listening. So this goes over 2 days, and the first day was weird, and the second day was extra weird, and I'll start where it starts. So we're working away on site out in the country at this facility, me and my colleague, and this particular facility, they shut the gates at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and that's it. The guards shut the gates and they open it up again in the morning. So we have to have packed up and be driving out by 5 o'clock. And we were rushing. We got packed up and we were literally the last ones out the gate, and they shut the gate behind us. We gave them a wave right on 5 o'clock. The weather that evening was horrendous. It was winter, but there was a real storm and lashing rain and driving wind and terrible, treacherous conditions to be driving a truck in, but that was just the conditions. So we leave the facility, we drive through the small country town, and we get out of that town and we're on to the highway, which is just a 2-lane road. It had become dark early and the rain was intense. The windscreen wipers were on maximum, but I could barely see off the front of the cab. The headlights weren't doing much of anything except for highlighting how much incredible rain there was. And the wind was really buffeting the truck, and it was coming side on at us and was, I guess, cyclonic. It was really the most fierce weather I'd ever been in. And my colleague next to me in the cab was commenting, we were both saying, wow, this is wild. This is absolutely wild. This is going to be a slow trip home. I was in a low gear just crawling along, and I was driving, and I could see probably about 50 meters in front of me, what I thought were taillights of a truck in front of me. And I could see that the wind was hitting this truck so hard that it was tipping the truck up almost as it was going to tip over, and then it would sit back down on its wheels. And as the wind hit that truck and tipped it up onto its side, almost tipping it over, it would then hit me and tip the truck up, almost tipping it over. And I was able to see by these lights in front of me when to brace and get ready and to counter steer into this incredible wind. And I was able to keep the truck upright, but crawling down the road at about 10 kilometers per hour. And it picked up, and it was even worse, and branches and even rocks were streaming across the road from right to left. And my colleague, and he's a big, tough guy, this guy, and bigger and tougher than me. And he said, are we going to make it? And by the tone and the fear, he didn't say, are we going to make the drive home? He said, are we going to live? And his words were, are we going to make it? And I said to him, whilst I'm battling to keep the truck upright, I said, as long as we stay in the cab, we'll be fine. And what I meant by that was, when the truck tips over, even if the windshield breaks, we'll be shielded from the debris by the underside of the truck. We just got to stay in the cab. And as soon as I said that, the wind went from, I don't know how fast, cyclonic, to nothing in the matter of seconds. And the rain stopped and everything stopped. And we sort of looked at each other, and I grabbed another gear, picked up a bit more speed and started driving off normally down the road, a little bit of debris to drive around. And then that cleared up, and we just got back up to highway speeds and we're cruising along at highway speed, going to each other, wow, that was really intense. That was really wild. And I was thinking to myself, well, I'm going to have to fill out paperwork for damage to the truck when I get back to the workshop, because what I could hear with this wind was the rocks and everything bashing against the side of the truck, making a terrible noise. And I thought, there's going to be dints and dings all over the truck. I'll have to fill out its paperwork. It's going to be a huge pain. And we're driving along and not much is happening. And then around the corner, to this day, I have no idea what it was. If it hadn't have been so intensely fast, I would say perhaps it could have been a motorbike with some kind of crazy jet engine attached to it. Because around the corner came 3 lights in the shape of a triangle, point up, and it roared past us, but the speed was too fast, even for a motorbike. I would think somewhere, I don't know, more than 200 kilometers per hour, far more than 200 kilometers per hour. That would be a really conservative estimate.
200 kilometers an hour would be conservative.
Yes.
Okay.
So, I mean, you see a fast motorbike come past you on the highway, that's totally fine. And, a bike at 200 kilometers per hour is fast, but you sort of get an idea of that speed. This was faster than that. I honestly, I don't know how fast, but at a guess, I would say somewhere between 300 and 500 kilometers per hour it passed us. In a split second, it was just long enough for me to see the 3 blinding lights, but the sound it made, it didn't sound like a motorbike. It sounded like, well, to tell you the truth, I've never heard a rocket in real life, but it sounded like a rocket, and it roared. It shook the truck with a roar, and it gave me an incredible fright, like a real adrenaline dump of a fright, and it frightened my colleague as well. He actually yelled out with a bit of a scream. It kind of actually took the tension out of it, and he said, and although there was no reason for him to say that, this is part of the weirdness of it. He said, oh, for a second there, I thought we were going to get anal probed. And we had a bit of a laugh, and that kind of took the tension out of it. But I have no idea what that was. And he also commented that why did that give me such a fright? And I said to him, that gave me a real fright too. And I couldn't understand. I mean, it was a sudden surprise, but it seemed a disproportionate amount of fear from that thing. And so we drove back, we get back to the workshop, we clocked off, and the time was 7:05 p.m. So it took us 2 hours and 5 minutes, and probably would have taken us about 2 hours if we hadn't have been going slow for this wild weather. And so that's important. It took us 2 hours to get home, and that's normal. I've taken this drive before. That's how long it takes to get home. The next day, we're there, we're working away, we work furiously hard. We finish the job. We've got all the gear loaded in the back of the truck. Again, we're the last ones out as the guards are shutting the gate behind us. We give them a wave. And as we're driving off down the road, we both commented to each other, I'm glad the weather is nice tonight. And it was a beautiful, clear night. And as we were leaving this small country town, the stars were out and it was beautiful. And the driving conditions were perfect. And I'm driving off down the road, and we get about an hour from where we left. And I noticed out of the window to my right, I could see through the trees at about 100 meters distance, 2 red lights, and they were keeping pace with us. And I know, because I've driven many times along this route, there's no road out there. There's just trees. And I thought perhaps it's a light somewhere in the cab reflecting off the window. So I buzzed the window down, and that got the attention of my colleague. And he said, "What's up?" And I said, "What's that out the window?" And he looked and said, if that's a plane, he's about to eat shit. And I agreed, because if that was a plane, which is the only thing I could think of was a light aircraft, and that I was seeing 2 red lights on the extremities of its wings, and it was moving exactly in pace with us. When I wound the window back up, I felt like if I had have drawn a small circle around that light on the window, it would have stayed within that circle. It was keeping pace perfectly with us. And I was looking at this thing and driving, and he was looking at it, my colleague, and we were both waiting for it to crash, but it never did. It somehow was able to get through the trees at a very low level, like mid-tree height. So, no more than 5 meters off the ground, and at 100 kilometers per hour. And it paced with us until we lost it going up and over a ridge, which was a windy, steep pass, and the forest was too thick for us to see it anymore. And then when we got over the ridge, we drove the rest of the way normally. And when we got back into the town where the workshop is, I made the comment to my colleague, oh, there must have been a power outage because all the lights are off and there's no cars around. And he agreed. And it became apparent that when we got back to the workshop, I went to clock off, and I was expecting to see 7 o'clock or around there, and I saw 9 o'clock. And actually it was 9:05. And I pulled the clock card back out of the machine, and I said, what the hell, 9 o'clock? And we had this confused discussion as to how could it be 9 o'clock? It can't be 9 o'clock. It must be because the power out is gone out, and the clock machine is playing up because of the power. We're just trying to fathom what the bloody hell had happened as to why this. We were thinking the machine must be displaying the wrong time. There's no way that it could be that time, because we just made our journey and we knew it took 2 hours. It took 2 hours the night before. There's no way it could take 4 hours.
So it was the exact same route.
There is only one route. It is the exact same route. The previous night, it took 2 hours, 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And this night, without explanation, it took 4 hours and 5 minutes.
Okay. And I'm thinking for myself personally, I can imagine what a 2-hour drive between the town I'm in currently and another city that's roughly 2 hours. So I'm just trying to picture it for myself. If I had arrived and it was 4 hours later, that would be, even though it's only an additional 2 hours, like if you really think about that, that's bizarre. And during this drive, was there any, obviously that you're witnessing this light tracking you for a bit, which I want to ask a question about in a moment, but other than that, was there anything abnormal? Was there any snippets of memory that you'd lost within that trip?
To answer your question, the timeline was perfect. There, nothing suggested anything, which was why we were thinking of all these wacky explanations rather than the actual explanation is that it took us 4 hours. We were thinking there must be something wrong with the machine. That's how certain we were that the journey only took 2 hours.
So what were some other indicators? I mean, obviously the lights were off.
Well, we checked with other clocks at the workshop, and they all agreed that it really was 5 minutes past 9 in the evening. And that explained why all of the shops in town were shut and there were no cars around.
It literally was in the real world around you. It literally was 9 o'clock because shops are closed. Everyone's quieting down, finished well past finishing work. Okay. So it definitely took 4 hours.
It definitely took 4 hours. It just took us a little while of deduction to actually come to that conclusion, because it just seemed impossible from our perspective, because it only took us 2 hours. Everything was normal. and we're trying to figure out ourselves. What I said to my colleague was, we can't clock off at 9 o'clock because they'll think that we've been at the pub for 2 hours and we want to get paid for it. So we actually wrote with a pen on our clock cards. We wrote our time, and I thought if
at 7:05 or something.
Yeah, as 7:05. Yeah, and I thought if payroll wants to have a crack at me for that, I'll just say, well, it was actually 9:05. So if you want to pay us the extra 2 hours, go for it.
Yeah, we were trying to do the right thing. We were at the pub, but we put it down to 7:05.
So, mind you, that's not something I'm going to do. I am not going to. It's zero alcohol for driving a truck for a start.
Yeah.
I certainly don't want to lose my license, and I'm certainly not going to be unsafe. I've got a family, so I'm strongly not going to go to a pub whilst driving a truck. So it was very, very bizarre. Oh, by the way, payroll never queried it, which was weird
payroll. Yeah.
in itself, because they would normally say, hey, you can't write on here. It has to be the machine's printout that's valid.
Yeah, so they would have seen the machine you clocked out at 9:05.
No, we didn't clock out. We actually wrote 7 o'clock on there rather than actually 9 o'clock, because we thought they're not going to believe us.
What I'm getting at is they would know that there was a discrepancy.
Well, no, they wouldn't know because there was no actual clocking off to stamp the time 9:05 on the clock card. It was just us writing it on there. But I was there. I know there was a discrepancy.
Yes, gotcha. Okay, so carry on.
I got home to my wife, who I told I was going to be home at 7 o'clock, and I was thinking she is going to be freaked out, thinking I've crashed the truck and died in the country somewhere. Because if you're 2 hours late when you say otherwise, I was worried, but she said nothing. And I said to her, sorry, I'm home so late. I have no idea why. I have no idea what happened. And she just looked at me and carried on. And that was weird in itself. I thought she was for sure going to say, I thought you were dead. Oh my gosh, why did you take so long? You were home by 7 o'clock last night. Why so much later? Or she said nothing.
And I mean, it would be pretty abnormal for a wife not to be concerned for their husband coming home 2 hours late. But she, I don't know her, the listeners don't know her. Would she be the type of character that would have sort of made a big deal out of it? Like, where the hell have you been?
That if I was a few minutes late, she would be worried.
Right.
I'd had an accident or something. Not that I've ever had an accident. She was just, because I was always very consistent. And
that puts it in perspective then.
So I was always very, very consistent. So if there was a slight delay, it would concern her because of how regularly on time I was. And this time I thought she was going to be really worried, but she said absolutely nothing. She didn't even mention it, which at the time I thought, okay, well, I don't have to deal with her being upset and worried. Just go to bed. And which I did. And so I want to say a couple of things here. What I didn't mention earlier was thinking when all of these rocks and branches were hitting the side of the truck, I was thinking I'm going to have to fill out all this paperwork and it's going to be all this drama. And when I got back to the workshop on the first night, I inspected the truck, which is a normal thing you do anyway, and nothing, not a mark, not even any mud, nothing to indicate anything. So at the time, I just went, oh, phew, I don't have to fill out any paperwork. I mean, I was a bit surprised, but I just put it down to perhaps it just sounded louder than it really was, and maybe the rain washed everything off. I got away with it. So that was strange. And the second thing I want to mention is that when we were going through that wild weather, and I could see what I thought were two red tail lights ahead of me, I think those red lights were the same red lights that I saw the second night flying through the trees at high speed. I would think that they were the same lights. And what I thought was a truck that was ahead of me in the mist and the torrent of rain wasn't a truck at all. It was something else.
And so that, just while you're on, that was what I wanted to ask about, was these red lights. So you couldn't make out what it was because it was dark, but you could see two red lights as if they were the lights, the wing lights of a small plane.
Think about being in really, really bad weather and a vehicle is far enough in front of you that you can't see the vehicle, you can just see the tail lights.
Gotcha. But the second night?
But the second night, it was clear and I couldn't see a vehicle. I could just see these two red lights. And I'm sure, and the reason I'm sure and thinking about it in hindsight, on the first night when the weather cleared up, there was no truck in front of me. I don't recall seeing tail lights disappearing into the distance. I never followed a truck. And I was traveling pretty lightweight for the truck I was in. So most trucks always travel fully loaded. There's no point doing anything else. But the toolkit I was carrying didn't constitute a full load. So going up the pass, I would have caught a truck. So I would have been sitting up behind them.
That's what leads you to believe that these were the same red lights, that it wasn't a truck. So let's talk about that second night. These two red lights, you may have already mentioned, sorry if you have, were these ahead of you or in your rear view?
No, they were in front of me. They were in front of me. Yeah.
So it's a clear night. So it's not like, oh yeah, that's vaguely possibly a truck. It's headlights, rather it's rear lights. This was a clear night, but you still couldn't gauge the exact object. Could you gauge, though, how far away the lights were from your truck?
Okay, so for clarification, the first night, I'm looking at what I thought were truck tail lights ahead of me through the front windscreen of the cab. I estimate the range to be 50 meters. On the second night, I was looking through my driver's side window. So I was looking to my right, across my right shoulder, and I estimate the range to be about 100 meters. They appeared to be the same object, the same brightness, the same size, the same distance apart.
Was it moving in a fashion that was different from a truck?
Well, the reason I thought that it wasn't a truck and it must be a plane, number one, it's rough terrain and forest, or like a sparse forest. There's no possible way that a ground vehicle could be driving at that speed. And it was somewhat off the ground and it wasn't following the terrain either. It was traversing with us. So I initially assumed it must be an aircraft because a vehicle would be following the terrain. But I thought it must be an aircraft and I thought it's about to crash into a tree any second because the number of trees there were no landing lights, there were no headlights on this thing. So it wasn't lighting up the terrain ahead of it or the trees around it. It was just two red lights moving at 100 kilometers per hour exactly. So that's the speed I was going through the forest.
And this is, I know you came back and it was supposedly 9 p.m., but normally you're arriving back at 7 p.m. Yes. What time of year is this? Is it light or dark?
This is midwinter.
It would have been dark.
Getting dark at like 5:30 in the evening. So,
okay.
Yeah.
And so,
fully dark.
You, at the time, other than thinking that was weird, must have been a plane, small plane, but that's weird. How could that be possible? Flying so low. You come back, it's 9 p.m., you've lost 2 hours. The shops are closed. All the clocks say 9 o'clock. You go home, your wife is just blasé about the whole thing. What happens next? Because you alluded to regaining some memory, perhaps.
It was actually difficult to get him to even acknowledge that any of the journey at all had happened. He did not want to discuss it at all. Eventually, he confirmed that there was some really wild weather and it was some really weird shit. And that was it. He did not want to discuss it. So that ends that there, except years later, many years later, I've had some regressive hypnosis, like we touched on at the start of the episode here. I recovered a bunch of memories about a missing time experience that was discussed previously. Several weeks after that, in a flash, all of a sudden, I recovered some memories of this missing time experience. Not much, just fragments, but enough. And the fragments are that I have a memory of my hands on the wheel of the truck, and I'm watching the engine speed indicator start to fall, and I could hear the sound of the engine decreasing in speed, and I could hear the turbocharger winding down. These are all very distinct and identifiable noises when you're driving a truck. I looked over at my colleague. He looked at me, and I said to him, "Off boost." So the truck was slowing down for some reason. All the gauges seemed to indicate correct position. Nothing was indicating as to why I was losing speed. I was just losing speed. Stopping a truck, especially at highway speeds, you got to really plan ahead to do it. I have another memory of standing on the road outside the cab of the truck. My door is open. I'm standing on the road. I'm looking at the road. I look back into the cab, up and across, and I could see my colleague who had his hands on the support bar in the front and his mouth open and tears streaming down his eyes. And I felt for him. I'm like, I don't want to say his name, but I felt, you poor guy. It must be really hard for you because he's such a big, tough guy. And crying, especially crying in front of somebody who he wants to maintain his reputation of being big and tough. I really felt for him that it must be a real blow emotionally for him to be going through this. And I have that as a cutscene. And then I'm standing outside the truck on the road near the door, but I've moved a little bit away from it. I've moved maybe 2 steps to my right away from the open door of the truck. In front of me on a bend in the road is a slab of steel or brushed aluminium, like the dimensions of maybe a house brick, but huge, massive, completely covering the entire road, the shoulders of the road, and into the trees, and probably about as high as the truck, and I can't quite see the back of it. And it's a massive, featureless piece of steel. And what shocked me was it wasn't touching the ground, and it was about a foot off the ground, and I could clearly see that there was nothing under it, nothing to support it. Didn't seem possible. And running up to me, almost in an excited way, was a Dune. And she was running up to me, like, not fully joyous, but pretty happy, as I would liken it to how one of my own daughters would run up to me if they hadn't seen me, and they were happy to see me. And it's only a fleeting memory, but it's there. And those series came back to me in a sudden rush. It really took me by surprise when it happened. It was just, I can't remember exactly what I was doing at the time, but it was mundane. It wasn't like something triggered it. It just bang, hit me. And my poor colleague crying, standing outside the truck, seeing this slab of steel, huge, and a Dune running up to me. And I was about to turn to her, but I really wish I could. Then I've tried, and I've sat down, I've meditated, I've asked the universe, I've tried to get something back as to what happened, but I haven't as yet been able to do that. And I really wonder, I think about it all the time, what that exchange would have been. So there was one other exchange with a Dune that, of all places, was on the main street in the town that I was living in at the time, a bustling, busy town, packed with people, and it was on the weekend. It's a tourist town, people everywhere, and I'm walking along, doing my thing, and I saw her coming towards me. I saw her about, probably about maybe 5 or 10 meters in front of me, and I stopped. I couldn't believe it. I had to sort of double check that I was seeing things correctly and did a big blink. And I'm like, is that her? That is her. Yeah, this is what's going through my head. Is that her? Is that, yeah, that's her. That is her. Hey, June. Hey, June was literally my thoughts. I know that sounds a little wacky, but she walked past me. She didn't look at me. It was her. She walked past me, and the look on her face was utter, complete sorrow. I've never seen anything like it. It was, I mean, you know what a sad person looks like. This was not that. This was times 1,000,000. And it was emanating from her, this feeling of sorrow, this sorrow for me, for her, for everything. Not sorrow that we can't talk, or sorrow for the whole thing. And it was just emanating out of her, and it was like almost tangible. You could almost grab it. And she walked past me, not quite close enough to graze my shoulder, but within a few centimeters. I was so shocked and stunned, so completely awestruck by this unbelievable weight of sorrow that came off her, had no idea what to do. And she's walked past. I didn't even turn back. I just let her go. And I just stood there for a second before walking off. And all of that is weird in itself anyway, because even if it wasn't her, I still feel like I would have run down the street and said, excuse me, excuse me. I didn't even do that. I just kept going. And it was like, I feel it was meant for me. What the actual meaning of it was, I don't know. But it blew me away that emotion could be that pure and that intense, and really feel like it's emanating from a person. Like if you have a big bonfire and you can feel the heat from it, that's what it felt like. Not heat, but that's what the sorrow felt like.
Really? That's a good analogy. So you can actually picture, like you said, you know what a sad person looks like, but this emotion was emanating, like you felt sorry. And she didn't make eye contact.
No, if you were to walk past somebody trying not to look at them, where you
Yes.
intentionally rather, you look just off to the side of their face, so you deliberately don't make eye contact. That's what it was. And again, the timeline, she looked like early 20s.
Wow, physical appearance.
Yes. She was more like a young woman rather than a girl.
I'll let you continue. My mind is spinning with questions, but carry on.
I felt glad that I had the experience, that I got to see her. I'm left with the feeling perhaps it was like a gift or a thank you or something. I really, really want to reconnect. And I wonder if I have, but I aren't able to remember. And perhaps I'm hoping that one day I will. If she is somehow listening, you're the most amazing daughter, and I really hope that we can catch up. I've got a lot of questions.
I bet you do.
So at this point, do you want me to? I mean, I can talk about another missing time experience that's briefer, but a little bit crazier. My apprentice was staying at my place, sleeping on my couch, and he got taken.
He got taken.
Yes.
Okay. Before we do, bro, for people that have heard the first episode, I sort of introduced you by saying, now I know that you have a million stories and I would love to hear that story. Let's just dedicate this episode perhaps to Adrian. And
yep.
I have a couple of questions, if you don't mind, before we wrap up. Would that be okay?
Go right ahead, Steve. As many questions as you like.
Well, I firstly want to acknowledge, for anyone who's listening and not watching the video, I hope you don't mind me saying, but you were visibly emotional when you were telling that story.
Because to me, this is like a daughter that I've only ever got to see a few times in my life. So, yes, I feel it. I do. I miss her. And like any parent would miss their own child. And I don't have a birth certificate or any evidence. She hasn't even told me that she's my daughter, but I'm sure of it. I'm absolutely sure of it. And with the missing time, the confusion, the inability to comprehend what's happening, at the point where the lit object roared around the corner at great speed with a huge noise, really genuinely scared me and my colleague, and it really did make him cry out in a somewhat hilarious way. And his comment about being anal probed, at the time, didn't seem like, because there was no indication of anything really had happened to do with anything. But now I look back on it and think that is perhaps suggesting that something had happened, and seemed like the appropriate thing to say. And the level of fear at seeing this object come around in the corner was disproportionate. Should not have scared us that much.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to make a comment on that, but in the midst of your story, it just sort of seemed perhaps like an odd comment. But now with you completing that story, he said that the first night though, right? And then the second night, neither of you know what happened. There's 2 hours missing, but in these glimpses of this sort of regression that you have, one of them was of him crying hysterically.
Yeah, I want to make it clear that during the regression that I did have, we didn't try to look at that experience at all.
Okay.
We were to fully paint the picture. There was this hypnosis session. What came out of it was in your last episode with me.
Yes.
Scared the absolute crap out of me, shocked me daily for years. And we were going to have another session, or as many sessions as I wanted, really, which is very kind of them, to uncover what had happened in this missing time experience that I've just described, driving the truck. But the first one scared me so badly that I couldn't go back. And I also want to say that if anybody is going through this kind of thing, just talking about these things can sometimes bring them on. And when I had this hypnosis session, the person conducting the hypnosis was aware of that. And we had weird things happening almost make it difficult for us to get together in the first place. Before, when Steve and I had problems connecting tonight, and I wonder, is that just technology or is it something else?
I wanted to just comment without being too. I wasn't going to say anything because I don't want either of us to come across as conspiracy nuts. But since we got your audio and visual working, and then we started recording, you've had clear picture and audio the whole time, and then right at the point where you said that you miss her or want to connect with her, your whole visual and audio was distorted.
Wow.
Yeah, you can go back and watch it for yourself. It's that stuff like that happens, but it was just fascinating timing. I wasn't going to mention anything because I don't want to speculate, but seeing as you brought that up, the technology thing, because I've heard that before as well, as sort of technology interference is very common in these sorts of stories.
Look, Steve, we can touch on that in other episodes, but what I did want to say with this hypnosis session, there was a spate of paranormal things happen in the house as a result of that, and it scared me enough that I didn't want to do another hypnosis session. So these recovered memories that I just talked about, these fragments, were not from a hypnosis session. I do want to make that clear. They were spontaneous, and they occurred outside of any other hypnosis. I've only ever done the one session, and it scared the pants off me, and there was a whole bunch of paranormal activity as a result, or at least in the immediate aftermath of that, which to me seemed related. And
okay, that's understood. So it was fragments that came to you sort of out of the blue. Yeah, understood.
I just want to make that clear. So in case your listeners are thinking that came from a hypnosis session, it did not.
Yeah. Thanks for clarifying that. And I want to wrap it up with this story. A couple of questions. Firstly, why do you think? So these were the facts that you've laid out as you had experienced them. And now I'll allow you to participate in some speculation. What do you think is the reason he had this extreme sorrow that was so palpable?
It's a great question. To me, it was such an encompassing sorrow. It wasn't just sorry for me or for her or anything that was happening between me or her. It was almost like it was sorrow for the planet, for all of us.
Really?
That's what it felt like. There was sorrow not just for me, not just for her, but for all of humanity.
And this occurred as she was walking through the crowd of people, which was the first of the three encounters where she'd been sort of in public, right?
Yes, it was so shocking because seeing her like that in public without any weird missing time, then that to me was the confirmation.
Yes.
That like this, I am most certainly not dreaming this.
And perhaps the context of the sorrow is you saw her in public without any missing time experience, sort of right there and then.
Well, I also feel, and it is speculation, that maybe a bit of that sorrow was, sorry, I can't stop and chat. I'm not allowed to, or I can't, or something. But it really, that single incident that couldn't have gone for more than 10 seconds absolutely slapped me in the face that this absolutely is happening. And because debunkers are always going to try to debunk. Mm-hmm. And I've got a memory blank and a solo experience on a rock in the wilderness. It's not like I've got anything on security camera or anything like that too. But seeing her on the street in a crowd of people, that was the defining thing that helped me with, yes, it's happening. Yes, this is really a thing. because my now ex-wife was completely unaccepting of all of this, seeing a UFO together, she would still say it can't be a UFO because they don't exist.
Mm.
And even if it was like a daytime sighting and it was behaving in a way that defied physics, and everybody else is going to say that's not human, she will definitely be saying it's not alien. Don't know what it is, but aliens don't exist. So I was going through a lot of that, and to see a Dune on the street was such a concrete thing that, yes, all of this is happening and all of this is real because there she is. And it's not like I know I was not confusing her with another person, because this is not, you don't see people like this. The hair was very straight, almost like a South American, like an Inca sort of straightness to it, but
Yes.
rust red, the rust red freckles, and the incredible golden rust red hued eyes. And it's just not a person. Like, you don't see people like that. I've never seen another person like that.
So that leads me to my next question, which is, you saw her in public, dead sober, no missing time experience, pretty lucid, normal. Do you think anyone else saw her? And was your wife with you at the time? Did she acknowledge it?
I was by myself at the time, and she was just another person on the street with a sea of people that I was passing left and right.
But you couldn't say the potentially other people saw her, but you wouldn't, all you were focused on was that 10 seconds, that mind-blowing interaction. Do you think that she was there only for you to be seen? Or do you think that he was walking amongst the crowd of people in physical form?
I think she was there as any other person was there at the time. But I do think that she was there to walk past me in the way that she. So if anybody else had been there, they would have seen this very unusual young woman. I'm sure that I didn't get the impression that she was only visible to me. It seemed.
What clothes was she wearing?
At that particular time, she was wearing a light-colored summer dress, and I didn't see the shoes, but she was wearing a summer dress.
What color?
It was, I want to say white, but it could have been a slightly off-white color.
Okay.
No, it was plain, but it was just a nice summer dress. It was appropriate for the weather at the time. Wouldn't have looked out of place for any young woman there. Plenty of young people, tourists in the town, would have just been another person that would have blended in. Although I'm sure if anybody else had seen her, they would have noted her unusual features, her unusual hair color and freckles and eye color.
Right.
Definitely a standout. Other than that, she would have passed for a person.
Okay. I think that's a really important distinction.
And I think the sorrow that I was feeling, if that had been for anybody else, everybody would have been stopping and staring like I was. Because it was so powerfully all-encompassing. It was. I think if anybody else felt that, then the whole street would have been stopped and staring at her, but that didn't happen.
Yeah, that's pretty significant. What if you yourself had only uncovered this, or started to, from this missing time experience under hypnosis? I understand that was the first episode was about the hypnosis session and the regression, and that this wasn't in that session, but nevertheless it led to all this. And so for you, even for you, having had these incredible experiences, even you have cutout memory, missing time, splotchy recall. How many other people do you think this has happened to, and that memory blanking or whatever has happened has stuck for them and they don't know?
Okay, I've got two that come to mind. One of them, which perhaps is a synchronicity in itself, occurred right at exactly the same spot I was standing when a Dune passed me in the street. The house I was living in at the time had a very large balcony, and it had beautiful panoramic views that looked over this tourist town and over the beautiful forest-covered mountains with a huge panorama of at least 180 degrees. Gorgeous, beautiful views.
I stopped you there. Sorry, I'm really sorry. I hate when I interrupt you. I'm so sorry. But you mentioned this on the UFO Chronicles podcast, didn't you?
Yes.
Okay, because when I was listening to it, I was in Melbourne and I wanted to ask, well, I was curious at the time where that was. What was it in Victoria?
Yes, yeah, in Victoria. It was in a town called Hillsville, which is about 50 kilometres northeast of the CBD of Melbourne. It's a beautiful tourist area renowned for food and wine and its natural beauty. And it's
Okay.
tourists all the time.
Okay, that was just my personal interest because there was actually another guy from Melbourne who had been on that podcast. I don't know if you've heard the episode. And he spoke about an experience in the Dandenong Ranges. And I just wondered if, in my head, I'd pictured that. But anyway, you were in Hillsville, and sorry, continue.
Okay, so it's a dinner party setting, and I have a father and his daughters over for dinner. And my young children are playing with his young children. The father and I are talking. It's a pleasant evening. And we are eating dinner, and we're all sitting at the big table eating dinner, and we're talking about things. At the time, I was seeing UFOs constantly, constantly. And I thought perhaps we could have some evening entertainment. And I said, who has ever seen a UFO here? And of course, my kids put their hand up, and I put my hand up, but nobody else did. And I said, who would like to see a UFO? And curious kids and even the father all looked at each other but put their hand up. And I said, okay, this is how it works. If you want to see a UFO, we'll go to the edge of the deck and we'll see what we can see. If you don't want to see a UFO, or if you're scared, that's okay. You can just go inside and play with the things inside, and we'll come and get you afterwards. But of course, everybody enjoying the whole evening wanted to see what they could see. So we go to the edge of the deck, and it's just after dark, and it's a pleasant evening. And after a minute or two, sure enough, coming towards us is this very bright light. At first, you could say perhaps it was the landing lights of an aircraft that was off course from the international airport, and it was coming straight for us. But as it got closer, it moved down below the height of the mountains, which put a range and a height on it. It meant that it was moving slower than an aircraft would have, and it was getting very, very bright, and it was approaching us. It came up over the township, up towards us, and of course, all of the kids are chattering, going, wow, what is it? It's a UFO. And the father pointed out, and it's important, this quote, he said, that's the brightest thing I've seen in the sky except for the sun. And I was smiling to myself thinking, great, this is having a good show for these guys. And it came right up over the top of us, and everybody leaned out over the balcony and watched it. And as soon as it got out of sight over the roof, we all rushed through the house as quick as we could, opened the front door opposite the balcony, and rushed out the front door, but couldn't see anything. And with the length of time it took us, we should have been able to see it, but it was gone. And of course, the rest of the night, that was dominating the conversation. And I was explaining to them that just even asking, you shall see or get or whatever. So that was a really mind-blowing experience for these guys. For me and my kids, it was just another night. So here's where we're talking about forgetting what's happened. A couple of weeks later, I was down in the street, and I only just made this connection tonight, Steve, with your help. Thank you very much. I met this guy on the exact spot where a Dune passed me on the street, the exact spot of all of where we could have met. It was right there. I didn't think of it at the time, but now I've made the connection now. And he stopped me and he said, hello. Oh, I just wanted to thank you for the really pleasant evening. And it was really, really nice. Thank you very much for having us over for dinner. And I made a comment about the light show as well. He said, light show? What light show? And I reminded him of seeing the UFO. And he's like, no, that can't have been me. You must have confused me with somebody else. I would have remembered that. And so I reminded him of his quote. That's the brightest thing I've seen in the sky except for the sun. And he said, well, that I'm doubly sure now you must have me confused because I would have remembered saying that. You must have me confused. So I left it at that, knowing how often people can see these things and not remember, or see them and remember something else differently. And I just left it. There's no point harassing him. Where it comes full circle is many years later, one of his daughters and one of my sons end up dating. And she is over at my house, a different house now. So we're over there and we were talking about paranormal things, and I was showing her the paranormal sensor light that we can talk and it comes on, ask it to turn off and it turns off. So we're doing, and the subject we got onto was people forget that they've seen UFOs. And I told her the story that I just told about her father and how I saw him in the street and that he said, no, you must have confused me with somebody else. And this girl suddenly, with a huge look of shock, and you could see the moment of recognition on her, she jolted with shock and said, oh my God, I remember that. Oh my God, I remember that. That's the most incredible thing that ever happened to me in my entire life. I remember it now, but I hadn't thought of it all of this time. How could I have not thought about that? And she literally said, that's the most incredible thing that's ever happened to me. And she couldn't fathom how she was unable to remember it until now, all of those years later. But I'm glad she did, because she was able to confirm that I didn't imagine it. Her father had forgotten it, and so had she, until many years later. It must have been 10 years later. I could probably figure it out with a pen and paper. Well, it must have been 10 years later. She was able to recall it, and then was at a loss to understand how she hadn't always been able to remember it. So that's how people can forget. I don't know why. I also have, in the house I'm in now, when I was first moving in with my partner, and you have to go through this process when you meet people and say, look, are you okay with this? Because this is in my life. If you are going to be around me, you'll be exposed to it. This is what it's like. And so I've been going through that, and we'd been having some experiences, and she was doing wonderfully great, which is, bless her, she's more awesome at this than I am. I said, okay, so if you want to see a UFO, let's go to the deck and we'll stand there. And this is 3:00 in the afternoon, mind you. And we'll see what we can see. This location is much more in a city. It's in the suburbs. It's not in the country. So I remember the loving feeling of taking you by the hand, and that feeling of love in a new relationship, and the support and the nurturing that I led her up to the edge of the deck and standing there. And I don't remember anything after that. A couple of years later, she said, remember that time you took us to the deck when we first moved in and we saw that UFO? And as soon as she said that, bang, I could remember seeing the UFO. I had no recollection of it at all. I hadn't even thought about it until she reminded me. Then I could remember it. And it was only the second time in my life where I saw a black triangle, and it was over the top of this large pine tree, a Norfolk pine tree, and it was shimmery, like covered in heat haze, and it was on an angle, and it faded out like you just turned the opacity to zero. And
how many, I suppose, of these experiences have people had and just not recalled, and not just with UFOs, but to bring it back to...
If you're going to forget these things, you can forget anything. My missing time. Have I had missing time that I'm utterly unaware of?
Well, that's exactly it. If it's missing time, you've only realized that it's missing if there were parts of that day or that night, like in your encounter in the last episode, that didn't line up, that didn't match up, or like you had in the truck. But what about during sleep or during a more mundane day where there are less variables and indicators to make you stop and think, hang on, what happened to those 2 hours? What happened to those 8 hours? How many times has that happened to people without them realizing, without them even jogging, getting them thinking about what the hell happened, let alone exploring in hypnosis or regression?
I think this happens way more than people know. I think it happens to people that have never even seen a UFO. And I think the only time where you are clued onto it is when they either allow it or they stuff it up, right? And otherwise, there's no evidence at all in your mind as to something have happened. Whenever these things have happened to me, it's only that there's been a little inconsistency that I've been able to know that something actually happened. I would put it to anybody that probably everybody has seen something, and even if you feel you've never seen something before, you've probably just forgotten. And the reason is for this girl I was just talking about. She'd gone her whole life without ever thinking she'd ever seen a UFO, and it wasn't until I prompted her that she was able to recall it. And when she did, it hit her like a bolt of lightning. And I've had exactly the same thing with my parents. They saw a UFO over my house, and it was on my birthday. And I went to visit them the day after, and I knocked on their door, and my father opened the door. And before he said anything, even hello, he opened the door and said, "We saw a UFO and it scared us." And so I asked them about it, and I said, "Where is it?" And they pointed, and what position? And I'm like, "That's over my house." And they're like, "Oh yeah, it is too. Yeah, that was right over your house. Yeah, right at midnight."
Wow.
And but the thing is, years later, when I was talking about this subject to my father about how people forget what they've seen, he said, "Well, I've never seen a UFO." And I reminded him of what he said to me, and he had the same bolt of lightning recollection of seeing a UFO. And so it was a fantastic proof to my point that people forget even something that really scares them, they'll still forget it. And you think about any other scary thing that's ever happened in your life. Let's just say you were in a car accident, or you fell off a horse, or anything scary. You remember it, and you remember it in HD, you know? So something's going on here. Right? Something is going on. And the effect isn't just localized for one person, because, and perhaps we can touch on this in more detail in another episode. She forgot about seeing a huge UFO in a busy area in Melbourne, and it was landed, and the police were there stopping traffic, and they interviewed her and took down her witness account, and she was with other people, and before driving off with this thing still on the ground. And she describes it as absolutely enormous, and she'd forgotten about it for years until she was prompted by one of the people that were there, and she could suddenly remember, and that must have affected the memories of thousands of people, including the police that were there, and all of them had forgotten about a gigantic, huge UFO landed on the side of the road in a really busy area in a location called Police Paddocks, which is in Melbourne in the suburbs, not far from where I am now. And everybody has forgotten about it, including her, until she was remembered.
That has just raised an entirely new paradigm for me, which is collective missing time experiences. Because when you said that just then, I immediately started thinking about the Grange UFO sighting in the 60s in Melbourne, which is arguably the UFO encounter that, in modern history at least, had the largest number of witnesses and corroborating stories. So when you're starting to say the police were there, this was in inner Melbourne, there was several other people, and this is not a story that we've heard of, then the mind boggles how many more UFO encounters around the world outside of Brentwaters, outside of Roswell, outside of the Grange. These are just the ones where, for whatever reason, it physically happened and there was no memory loss of the witnesses or the military or police. And I was going to say, sarcastically, thanks for leaving me with the scary thought that I may have had some alien contact that I'm unaware of right before I go to sleep. But then I thought, this is something that you yourself have had to go through. And so on that note, I again want to thank you so much for sharing your story, for being so authentic. And not that you needed to be, but thank you for being so thorough with the facts and the details in advance of the extraordinary events that proceeded, because I think that is really compelling. And it's compelling when you talk about as well, I think it's really compelling that so many of these stories are so patchy that if you were making it up, it wouldn't actually be a very interesting story. You would fill in all the blanks, wouldn't you, if you were making it up? So look, thank you.
I'm feeling it like it is. I'm just telling it to the best of my ability to recall it exactly like it is. And if it sounds disjointed or weird or not compelling, it doesn't. Just tell people what happened.
Yes, and I was meaning specifically within the truck and how there were fragmented memories within that story. Had you been making it up, you would have said, oh, look, there was no missing time. We saw this, and then this happened, and then we went on a spacecraft or whatever. You just sort of told it as it happened, as you recall. We allowed some speculation, which I think is important to have you state your experience, and for future guests as well, I'd like this to sort of be the course of action is state your experience as you experienced it, and then we can perhaps allow for some speculation. And the speculation's endless, but we do have to wrap up, and I am really excited for next week because I know I have an inkling of what you're going to share, and they're different stories entirely. I know you have a million, but I'm asking for two in particular. And well, I wasn't going to mention, but I haven't even heard the story yet from you. But one of them involves a cryptid creature known as the Dogman. I implore you to look up on Spotify a podcast called The Dogman Encounters. There's over 500 episodes of people sharing their experiences like you have, and you listen to enough facts, and there's something really compelling there, and you may potentially have one of those stories. So we're going to stop it there, and we're going to bring it back next week. Brock, thanks so much again for your time tonight on the Cosmic Banter podcast, and look forward to chatting again next week.
Thank you so much, Steve. It was really a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Have a good night.